Hey everybody, I'm in my living room because I imagine at least a number of you experienced Suncrest On Demand in your living room, and I have some big news for you today. We have 2 weeks left of this one at a time series, but the series that comes after that, starting the first weekend of October, is going to be unique in that we are shifting gears to do something different online than we're doing in person. Let me describe both of those to you. In person, we're going to do a series called At the Movies, and it's going to be this tremendous experience where our facility is transformed, where the experience when people walk in is very unique, where we're going to use both scriptures and movie clips to help people navigate life and faith and experiences with God. I can't wait for what's going to happen in person for those 3 weeks. And maybe for you, if you've been a regular online, this is the perfect occasion to check us out in person, maybe for the first time, or to come back if you've been at Suncrest before. We would be absolutely thrilled to have you join us in person. It's going to be such a unique experience. But online, things are going to be different. Because we're doing a movie series, we can't use all of those clips in YouTube and those different settings. And so we're going to do a reboot of a 3-week series that I did just before the pandemic. It's called Getting Past Your Past. It's actually a series that I've done twice in the history of Suncrest, and perhaps it's the most impactful series that we've ever done. For anyone who struggles because they have a hang up in their life, something has happened to them in their past that just seems to keep gnawing at them, this is perfect for you. And so if you need to stay online, or if this theme is exactly what you need right now, I just want you to know that for the first 3 weeks of October, it will be different than what we're doing in person at Suncrest, but we're trying to create a great experience for you. And in this case, it might be the perfect one to share as widely as possible with friends and family, the people you see in places where you work and live and play. So, Suncrest, I love you. I'm glad to have you join us online today. And today is episode 5 of One at a Time.
One thing we probably have in common is that we all want to make a difference with our lives. A word that you hear a lot these days, especially with the rise of social media, is the word influencer. And I think all of us on some level want to live that kind of life. And the question is, how do we do that? And as I read through the Gospels with this in mind, it just seemed clear to me, Jesus changed the world one at a time. One conversation at a time, one interruption at a time, one meal at a time, one need at a time, but always one person at a time. And so my prayer is that together, as we study the life of Jesus, we will learn that each of us today will have an opportunity to live a one-at-a-time life. It is the Jesus way of changing the world.
I'm struck kind of at this point in the series. We are in week 5 of a 6-week series called One at a Time. And I plan all these series, and I always think each series is going to be the greatest series of all time. But every now and then, one will emerge to become kind of a defining, memorable series for our whole church, where 2 or 3 or 5 years later, people will still use the language of that series. And I have absolutely zero doubts at this stage that One at a Time has become one of those series. I've enjoyed listening to all your stories of running into people randomly, having conversations, one at a time at work and refocusing yourself that way. We've encouraged all of you to be part of a group at Suncrest. I hope you've done that. Being relationally connected is so important to an experience in a church, but more than 100 people stepped into those groups for this series. And I know the group that I lead that happens on Saturday morning with some guys, it's been so interesting to see this has caught their attention. And now we're starting to talk about oh yeah, I'm noticing maybe God wants me to lean into that relationship. And then the next week we start to talk about it and we're like, oh, I tried and I totally messed it up, right? Have you had those conversations where but we're learning, and I see people stepping in and saying, oh, it kind of puts some wind in my sails. It gives me some purpose in life. There's meaning for my relationships, and God really can use you to make a difference. So I'm very excited about this. Now, I'm going to jump right into the message here, because not only is One at a Time a great way to follow Jesus and changing people's lives, One at a Time is definitely a theory for preaching also. If I give you 3 things in one message, I know it's going to be a dud of a message. I have to give you one thing at a time. And yet, even though I know that, I've decided to include multiple things in this message. And if I do it right, they're all going to converge at the end in ways that are beautiful and life-changing for you. If I do it wrong, you'll be just tell me in the comments. I'll change it by Sunday, okay? So let me jump right into this, because there's a few big ideas that I want you to capture. Last week, I told you that for One at a Time, you can kind of imagine God's sovereignty in this, that when you cross paths with people, it isn't random. And last week, I talked a lot about intersections, as if you're kind of coming down the path or coming down the street or coming down the hall, whatever it is, you're coming this way, and someone else is coming this way. You didn't know they were coming, but God knew. And that these aren't accidents. These aren't random circumstances. God actually places people in your path that he wants you to engage in those moments. And we talked all about things that they might be encountering. And I name that today because when we talk about God's sovereignty, I want you to have an appreciation that he is ultimately in control and he is arranging circumstances more than you probably ever suspect. But one thing that can happen whenever I talk to people about God's sovereignty is they can take it to one extreme, one pendulum swing over this direction and start to think, well, if God is sovereign, then my job is basically just to wander through life and consider, well, who might he bring in my path? And that's where I'd say, let's keep talking about God's sovereignty. If you've ever been in a conversation with me where you're trying to figure out something about life, there's probably a 50-50 chance that I gave you a framework that sounds something like this. I'd say, well, I think what you need to sort out for your next step is to say, so what is your part? And what is God's part? And if it's a relational thing, what is their part? And if you can start to sort that out, and for you not to try to take on God's part, that's a big deal. But for you to do your part, that's a big deal. And we start to sort it out like that. And this is the beauty of what God's sovereignty truly is. It's that not only is he ultimately in control of all things, but in his sovereignty, he gave each human being some sovereignty. We call it free will or the ability to choose. We talk about the idea that God actually gave us, as he deposited his image in us, the ability for us to aim at certain things and arrange certain circumstances and all those sorts of things. And so this isn't an encouragement to live life just wandering and wonder who God will bring in your path. Part of the sovereignty is to say, okay, God has given you and he has given me not just the ability, not just the gift, but the responsibility to aim my life at the most important things. And so maybe the word that we use culturally the most for that these days is the word intentionality, that I would aim at something, I'd be intentional about what I'm doing. So there are 3 things that I want you to think about and how intentionality works, and I'll hopefully try to weave all these together at the end. Here's the first one. Be intentional because there is the impact of going the extra mile. Now, I'm going to show you some scriptures here in a moment. This is not surprising to you that Jesus taught us to go the extra mile, but let's just think for a moment about why that would be so important. Jesus had in mind to change the world. Maybe surprisingly to you, over the last few weeks, you've learned that the way he changed the world is that he engaged people one at a time. And what Jesus knew is that if you were going to have an effect, if you were going to have an impact on somebody's life, you wouldn't be able to do just what's expected. You wouldn't be able to just give them what they gave you, return this for that. Jesus knows that if you are going to have an impact in this world, which I think we all want to do, we want to live a meaningful life, that one of the elements that has to be present there is you have to jostle someone in order to get their attention. Otherwise, we're just all kind of roaming our way through life. And one of the ways Jesus encourages us to jostle people is to say, you go extra. You go the extra mile. Now, I've been thinking about this in lots of different realms. Some of you are familiar with the Lilly Endowment. It's based in Indianapolis. It's a great gift to the state of Indiana. There's a lot of philanthropy, generosity that happens with the Lilly Endowment. I have received some grants. The Suncrest has received some grants from the Lilly Endowment before. And the Lilly Endowment is one of the most generous endowments that I've ever seen. And I had someone describe them to me this way once. They said, most of the time when a person or a nonprofit asks for a grant, they say, hey, I need this. I want to do this. It's going to cost $1. And the grant-making organization says, I appreciate your vision. We only have 50 cents. What could you do for 50 cents? But when you go to the Lilly Endowment and you say to someone, hey, I have this vision for something beautiful that could happen, and it's going to cost $1. The posture of the Lilly Endowment to come back to you is to say, but what could you do if you had $2? Just extra. And it's interesting that just doubling the amount, it doesn't just double the impact, it actually allows you to imagine and jostles you in such a way that you can see different things that are new. And I won't forget this. I've had people who have gone the extra mile for me. Last weekend, I told you about the passing of my father a number of years ago. My hometown is 5 hours from here. When we got up for the funeral that morning and were preparing to go through that, I didn't think 3 people would come from Northwest Indiana. It's a long drive. I did not expect people to come. And then I look up at the end of the funeral. I had all these friends who were there. And it jostled me. It's like, wow, they care. That meant something. Someone didn't just do what was expected. Nobody would expect it. They went the extra mile. Some time ago, we were doing some simple bonuses for our staff. And bonuses were a percentage of your salary. And our elders came to me and they said, Greg, we see the work that you've done. We see what you've led through. And they gave me a bonus. It was 1% more than the other bonuses. But it was extra. It was like they named something. They did something for me that I'm like, wow. And it didn't just give me a 1% boost. It jostled me in such a way that like, oh my goodness, that is moving. That changed. This is what going the extra mile. That's what the impact of the extra mile is. This is, of course, how Jesus was teaching it in the Sermon on the Mount. He says, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. That'll get their attention. They slap you on the right cheek. This is not a punch. This is an insult. This is a backslap. And Jesus says, when that happens, everyone would expect you just to fight back, to run away, to do those sorts of things. What if you do something else? What if you go extra? He says, and if anyone wants to sue you to take your shirt, just give them your coat too. Why would you do that? Well, the reason you would do that is because this world has enough of people who just do what everyone expects. This world has enough of people who just get hit and hit back, fight and fight back, get sued and sue back. Of course, that's how the world works, and it changes nothing. And Jesus says, how about this? How about if they sue you for your shirt? Give them your coat too. And then he says, and if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Now, you've heard me describe this maybe before. This was just compulsory public service in Jesus' day. Anyone who was in authority, it could have been a priest, it could have been a commander in the army, it could have been a politician, could choose any Jewish person at any time and say, hey, you have to do this for me, and you're required to go 1 mile. And what Jesus is saying is that, hey, they want you to go 1 mile, you go 2. Why would you do that? Well, it's a totally different orientation than what many of us may have and what many of us may feel justified in. You see, if the way that I act toward others is actually just a reflection of how they have acted toward me, then no doubt the strategy would be to be guarded, to protect myself, to not let anyone take advantage of me, to do all those things. And Jesus says, no. We're trying to change the world. And one of the ways to have an immediate impact is to go the extra mile. In fact, Jesus ultimately asks this question. He says, if you love those who love you, what are you doing more than others? And for those of us who are followers of Jesus, I know not all of you are, but for those of us who are, this is part of the distinct life that Jesus calls us to. He says, don't do what everybody else is doing. Don't go the way of the world. Don't pay back for it. Don't do that. Go the extra mile. Now, this is important to gauge. Let me say this before I move on. You actually can't go the extra mile all the time. Jesus cares about your physical health and your mental health and all those sorts of things. You can't redline it. Burning out benefits no one. And so, you have to look and aim and say, oh, in this moment, in this situation, I'm going to go the extra mile. You can't redline it. You can't burn out. But you can't not do this. So, be intentional. Impact comes from going the extra mile. Here's number 2. Be intentional. Let's talk for a few moments about the value of the soul. Now, maybe it's not unusual to have a conversation in church about the soul, but I find a lot of competing views and a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of speculation about what the soul actually is. One of my favorite lines from one of my favorite Christmas songs, Oh Holy Night, talks about the moment that Christ appeared and the soul felt its worth. And even just culturally, we at least can start to get at the idea of how valuable a soul is. Tonight, I'm talking to you about your soul, and I'm talking to you about the souls of the people that are around you. If you're a parent, I pray you are nurturing the soul of your child. And if you're a boss, I pray that you're paying attention to the soul of your workers. And if you're a neighbor in God's place, I pray you're thinking about the soul of your neighbors. We tend to use in our world the word soul as an adjective for other words. And it starts to get at what we mean. We'll talk about soul music or soul food, or you found your soul mate, or I'm doing some soul searching. And what do we think about? I think this starts to get at what do we think about when you say you're doing some soul searching? It actually means that I'm starting to ask myself some questions that are in the realm of the biggest questions of life, the most fundamental questions of life. If you and I were to do some soul searching for ourselves, we would ask ourselves questions like, who am I? What difference am I even making in this world? Who is God? And does he have something in mind for my life? Is there a life beyond this one that I ought to be paying attention to during this one? Your soul. And it's so interesting for me when people try to describe the nature of the soul. People come up with all kinds of different ideas. I started to Google it, and these are some charts that kind of represent some of that. Some people see it like this, like your spirit, your soul, your body, and you in the middle of that. That's not a good picture, by the way. Let me give you a second one. Some people look at it something like this, and like, oh, it's kind of concentric circles. You have your will, your mind, your body, and your soul. They usually take the soul and they make it one of the things that makes up you. There's a chart like this that says, oh, well, let's do it this way. Mind and spirit and soul and body. You put all that together, and that's you. And then there's charts like this. It's an interesting one to me. Spirit, mind, body, soul. And this person decided to put heart in the middle of it. Now, I don't think there's a perfect chart. I'm getting kind of judgy toward these charts. But when I tried to draw one myself, I completely failed to be able to create one to show to you. If I was going to help you try to understand this in the way that I think is most helpful conceptually, what I might do here is take the heart and move it over here and take the soul and put it in the center. I think in the way that the scriptures, actually I'm very confident, in the way that the scriptures describe the soul, it is the center of who you are. It's the core of who you are. It's something you should pay attention to and nurture. And it's not something that we should just be self-reflective about. It's when we see other people, we should appreciate their souls. Now, souls are not the only important thing. All these other things are important. Maybe you've heard there's some, this probably goes back 50 years, but churches might say, we're going soul winning. I'm like, no, that's not really what we're doing. It's not like you're some disembodied soul. Your mind matters, and your heart, your emotions, they matter, and your body, it actually matters. And I would put relationships in here. The social aspect of you matters. But the way your soul will get out of whack is that you will idolize one of these other things. You will idolize your body, or you will idolize your mind, or you will idolize your heart, your emotions. You'll let them define everything else. Or the way to really, also hurt your soul is to be dismissive of the value, because taking care of your body and your mind and your heart, your relationships, that shapes your soul. And one of the things Jesus talks about is the ultimate value of your soul, because your soul is who you are. Here's what Jesus said. He says, do not be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. He says, listen, we should rank order these things. And the soul is the most important thing. And so when you think about that yourself, but also when you think about the people who God has placed in your path, and you look at their soul, you know what I find? There's a lot of times souls just feel lost. There's another interesting passage. This is, let me kind of describe it to you. It says Jesus spoke plainly about this. What he was speaking plainly about is that he was going to suffer and die. And his followers didn't really like that kind of news. They were not looking forward to some physical pain. So Peter, the outspoken one, took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus. Hey, Jesus, this thing about you suffering and dying, let's not go there. So let me just tell you this. I always tell people, you're welcome to be mad at God. You are. You can express your feelings. You can express your anger. He can take it. He can. What you should not do is expect that you can say things to God that rebuke him and think that he doesn't have some things to say to you. That, like, if you're going to give it to him, just be ready for what he has for you. And this is what happens with Jesus. Jesus turned around and looked at his disciples, and he rebuked Peter. Actually, he said, "Get behind me, Satan." Right? I've never called any of you Satan. Yeah? Not that I'm looking for special credit for that, but I'm just saying Jesus, like, he went for it here. He says, "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but only merely human concerns." And this is what he's getting at. He's getting at the distinction of the soul versus other things. And of course, we get into situations where we get concerned with physical things, with this realm, with the world around us, and that starts to get our attention. Actually, it could become a little bit of an idol, but Jesus is warning us. He's warning us. Actually, what he eventually says is this: what good is it to gain the whole world and yet forfeit your soul? I have seen this question in various forms define a midlife crisis. Someone went for it. They went for life on their own. They aimed at the things they thought were worth aiming at. They chased them. They got them. And it was empty. And someone should ask the question, what good is it? Jesus did ask the question, what good is it to gain the whole world and lose your soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? And so, when you're being intentional about life, your life, when you're being intentional about relationships with other people, I want you to be intentional about looking at our soul. When people have a healthy soul, they can answer the question, who am I? And since then you know who you are, you can walk with some confidence in this world. You can answer the question, what difference should I be making? The scriptures would teach you, like God has a mission for you. These are the differences you should go make in this world. It's a very broken place. Try to heal it. People need to have a redemption experience with God. Lead them to it. That's the difference he wants you to make. You should have a sense of what happens after this life and that your soul does not come to an end when you breathe your last. Your soul is eternal, and it will be with God or not. You can ask the most important questions of life, and when your soul is in a good place, you have the right answers. So, if we're being intentional about going extra relationally to make an impact on the world, and we're being intentional about the value, the worth of a soul, I think what it leads us to be intentional about is to be intentional about the one who matters most. So I've been asking you kind of in the widest funnel sort of thing to engage people one at a time. Whoever crosses your path, think perhaps God wants me to engage them. As you go, think, man, God might want to use me in their life. I could make an impact for them. I could say something encouraging. I could go the extra mile. Do that with everyone. But don't let doing it with everyone keep you from focusing on the most important one, the one who matters most. I want to cast a little vision for you here. You probably have people in your life who are hurting physically. I hope that you're there for them physically. Maybe you can help them out somehow or encourage them. You probably have people in your life who are hurting or are lost mentally or intellectually. Lean into that. I think you can make an impact in their life when you help people kind of find their way intellectually. You probably have people in your life who relationally or socially, it is not clicking. They are off, and you could care for someone like that and do extra things for them. And while all of that has value, and I hope as followers of Jesus, we'll be the first to engage to it, there is nothing more important than looking at someone's life whose soul is not in a healthy place and saying, God, I'd like to help that one. God, would you use my voice? Would you use my encouragement? Would you use me going the extra mile in their life? So when you aim with this ability and gift and responsibility that God gives you, and you think, I want to engage people one at a time, I think the scriptures, I'll show you in a moment, uniquely lift up, for those of us who are followers of Jesus, say, scan the landscape of your life. Who is God leading you to? And it's someone whose soul is distressed, someone whose soul is wandering, someone whose soul is lost, someone whose soul is confused. Who is that in your life? It's interesting the way that Jesus talks about this. A few weeks ago, to start the series, we did Luke 15, right? There was a lost sheep. Jesus saw the one who was lost, and then he went after it and then celebrated it when it was saved. Then there was a lost coin, same thing. Then there was a lost son. And this is so fascinating to me. When the lost son comes home, he had physical, he had been hungry. He'd kind of lost his mind, lost his way when he was going about it. He comes home and he thinks, I'd just like to have a job with my dad. And dad could have easily justified that. But dad didn't. He restored him to be part of the family. And he said, we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and he's alive again. He was lost and now he's found. And so for those of us who are followers of Jesus, we scan the landscape of our lives, the relational circles that we have, and we're like, man, who is it that's struggling spiritually? Who is it that is a lost soul or a confused soul? Who is it that God might use me in their life in that particular way? It would have the greatest impact because of the worth of a soul. Jesus has another example. It's also in the Gospel of Luke. Zacchaeus. Remember, one at a time, Jesus says, hey, the guy up in the tree, I'd like to go to your house today. He goes to Zacchaeus' house. They have a conversation that gets right at Zacchaeus' soul. And then this is what it says. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house. Listen, Zacchaeus had everything the world said to offer. He was a very wealthy man. And Zacchaeus, his soul was empty. He did not have a connection with God. He actually had been running from God for some time. But Jesus invited him in. He went extra. He went to his house. And Jesus said, something changed today. Because I aimed at the person whose soul was lost. Actually, then Jesus said this, the Son of Man, this is the whole thing he came to do, to seek and save those who are lost. It was the primary thing, and it's the primary thing for our church. And I pray that it's the primary thing in your relational world when you go one at a time. Think, but who's the one whose soul is struggling right now? And then earlier in the Gospel of Luke, you'll be familiar with this, but let me tell the story very quickly. It says he told them, and this is Jesus, he's speaking to a group. Let me give you a little context. He actually sent them out 2 by 2. Instead of one at a time, this was 2 by 2, and wanted them to go and share the message of who Christ is. He says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. There's all kinds of lost souls out there. There's all kinds of hurting souls and struggling souls. There are people who have lost their connection with God or never had one. The harvest is plentiful, but not that many people going out. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. And then get this, he says, go. I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves. Jesus did not have a beautiful strategy that would be pain-free for the people who would step into these relationships. He said, actually, what's going to happen is you start to stir some of these conversations. Some people will receive it and some people won't. He actually said, go into these villages and find a person of peace, someone who would receive your message openly. But if someone won't receive your message, this is where he says, take the dust, brush the dust off your feet and move on. Because not only do you have a part and God has a part, but they have a part to be receptive or not. And then, shortly later, he says, on one occasion, the expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must we do to inherit this eternal life? Well, what's written in the law? Jesus replied, how do you read it? And he answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. He's just quoting the Old Testament here. He knows what the Old Testament says about being a follower. You've answered correctly, Jesus replied. This is important. You've answered correctly. You know the right answer. Do this, and you will live. Of course, he didn't mean do this, and you'll wake up breathing tomorrow. That's not what he meant. He meant do this, and your soul will live. Do this, and you'll have this eternal life. Live this kind of life that goes out there. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Now, I'm going to say something here, and it may sound judgmental to you, but I'm only teaching to myself here for a moment. I don't know how many times I've been a part of a group that decides, hey, we're going to study some scripture together. We're going to look at this. That's a very healthy thing. I want you to study scripture. I want you to do it together with other people. But people sit around and study scripture and then don't go do what it says, right? And somehow we think that more knowledge is the move for us. And Jesus is always like, no. I think you got it. Go do it. But this guy wanted to justify himself. So Jesus told a story in response. Maybe you've heard this story before. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho where he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest. And so let's just imagine like who the priest would be in the story. Let's call it me, okay? Like the pastor, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the religious leaders in their day. A priest is coming down the road just after someone was beat up. No problem, right? We got a godly person coming down the road right after this. The priest happens to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Now, you can judge him. You can judge me if you want to. It's not that I've never done that. I probably did it for the same reason that priest did it. I'm going somewhere. I'm busy. Something important is I don't have time. Fair enough. So too, a Levite. So what's a Levite? Well, he's basically a religious person. So if I'm the priest, you're the Levite. Okay? A Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. You ever done that? You saw somebody in need, but you had more important things to do. You couldn't stop and help. But a Samaritan, and in Jesus' day, when he said Samaritan, you might have even verbally heard like, boo, those Samaritans. As he traveled, he came to where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. Now, I don't actually like this English translation because we tend to think of pity as not necessarily that healthy of a thing. More likely, the better interpretation here is had compassion, had active compassion. That's what took pity means. This phrase, as it's used, only gets used of Jesus in other parts of the scriptures. So it's someone whose heart was shook. God got his attention and said, okay, I'm going to do something. So he went to him and he bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey and brought him to an inn, and he took care of him. Right? Anyone could have justified like, hey, I'm going to bandage your wounds. Let me say a little prayer over you before I go, and I go. But he didn't do that. He did extra. He went the extra mile. He took him to the inn. And then it's interesting. The next day, he took out 2 denarii, this is cash, and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said. And when I return, I'll reimburse you for any extra expense that you may have. Well, this is getting people's attention. Because he didn't just bandage them up and go away. He went the extra mile for someone who was broken. So, Jesus says, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of robbers? And the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. So, if we're supposed to be intentional about the impact of going the extra mile, and we're supposed to be intentional about the value of a soul, and then Jesus gives us this image that our whole mission is to seek and save the lost. And then he gives us a story that reminds us that we might be prone just to study about it and not do it, or we might be prone when there's an opportunity in front of us just to walk by and not do anything. Jesus has all of this converging, I think, to say to you and I, who's the person in your life who's disconnected from faith, who's disconnected from God, who's disconnected from church. At the core of their life, at the level of their soul, something's off right now. Maybe it's lost, maybe it's confused, maybe it's disintegrated. I don't know what it is. But God has placed you in their life. I've been hearing stories about what happens one at a time, and one of the stories I heard hit me as a good example of this. So just for 2 minutes, I want you to hear Catherine's story.
About 6 years ago, when I became part of Suncrest in the worship team, I was so excited. I invited a lot of my friends to church. Well, this one friend in particular, who's a very close friend of mine, ended up coming week after week with her family until COVID hit. So after COVID, she didn't come back. Now, there wasn't really a good reason. It was, just a new habit. She was out of routine. She didn't come back. So I tried everything I could within these last 2 years. I tried persuading. I tried sending links of Pastor Greg's sermons. I tried telling her, hey, they played your favorite song this week, but to no avail. So fast forward to about a week ago, it was her birthday. Now keep in mind, last year, she had a big birthday and it was terrible. Nothing happened. Nobody celebrated it. So I was going to make sure this year was different. So I had a surprise party with her, coordinated with her husband, had a lot of local friends come out and celebrate. So at this party, another friend of ours from Suncrest said, hey, we miss you. Where have you been? We'd love to have you at church again. And, it was just casual conversation after that between us. And it wasn't until that evening that she came up to me and gave me a big hug. Just said, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate this. I really needed this. And she said, I think I'm going to start coming to church again. And it was at that moment that I realized this is what it's about. It's not about my will and my persuasive skills over the last 2 years. It's about God using my friend and I to really give her a display of love, to encourage her to come back to church.
So let me just use Catherine's story. Your story will be different. There'll be different circumstances. You'll do something different extra than she did. But Jesus would tell us, go and do likewise.
I was buried beneath my shame. Who could carry that kind of weight? It was my tomb till I met. I was breathing, but not alive. All my failures I tried to hide. needed rescue, my sin was heavy, but chains break at the weight of your glory. I needed shelter, I was an orphan, now you call me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing, now your love is the air that I'm breathing. I have a future, my eyes are open, 'cause when you call my name, I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. You called my name, and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness, into your glorious day. Oh!
I hope that this has been a meaningful experience for you, even online. And I want you to know that every time that we get together, both online and in person, we include a time of communion. This is a moment for people who follow Jesus to look back on life and remember with gratitude all the amazing things that God has done, our need for God right now, and to look forward with hope, knowing that God is with us every step of the way. So now is the time to get some food and drink to represent Jesus' body and his blood that was broken and poured out for each and every one of us. And during that time, we're going to reflect together. If you don't follow Jesus, that's totally okay. I'm glad that you're checking out this video. Go ahead and use this time to reflect on what you've heard so far. And with that, let's focus on the love of Jesus together. Before you turn off this video, go ahead and hit the like, subscribe, and share button. And I want you to know that this video, this isn't the church. You are. So this week, I hope that you go and make a difference, that you go and be the church.